Okay, hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this exciting talk. My name is Angie Bautista Chavez and I will be the moderator for today's event. So again, my name is Angie Bautista Chavez. I am a postdoctoral research scholar in the School of Politics and Global Studies at ASU. And today we have a talk titled Citizenship Reimagined, a new framework for state rights in the United States. And our speakers today are Allan Colbern and Karthick Ramakrishnan. So I will briefly introduce the center, who is the host of this talk today. I'll read you our short mission statement, and then I'll introduce the speakers, and then I'll hand it over for about a 30 to 40 minute talk, and then we'll conclude with Q&A. So we are the Center for Latina and Latinos in American Politics Research, and our mission is to foster and support thoughtful, objective, and innovative research on the political and policy circumstances of the nation's Latino, Latina, Hispanic population, thereby creating a fuller and deeper understanding of politics and governance in the United States. The mission entails facilitating and disseminating research that emphasizes, but is not limited to, the empirical or normative theoretical perspectives, historical context, institutional dimensions, and public policy issues, which are especially germane to the Latino-Latina population, while also having broad significance for American society and politics. And so now I will introduce our two guest speakers. Today we have Allan Colbern. He is an assistant professor of political science in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at ASU. He is a presidential award recipient from the Russell Sage Foundation and Carnegie Corporation, and his research has been featured in the Washington Post and the LA Times. Karthick Ramakrishnan is a professor of public policy and political science at the University of California, Riverside, and founding director of its Center for Social Innovation. He serves on the board of the California Endowment, chairs the California Commission on APIA Affairs, serves as director of the Inland Empire Census Complete Count Committee, and he directs the National Asian American Survey, and is the founder of aapidata.com. So with that, I will turn it over to our two guest speakers. And just to let you know, I'll be keeping time. I'll probably chime in and let you know that when you're at maybe the 30-minute mark to let you know. Okay, thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Angie. Well, first I'll let Allan just say his welcome as the home talent here at ASU, and Allan, go ahead and then kick it off to me, and I'll start the presentation.
Yeah, I just want to thank the center for hosting this book talk. Thanks, Angie, for helping get this moving, and Rodney for hosting us. And so, yeah, we're excited to be here and present the work at ASU for the first time. But I'll let Karthick take it over, and then we'll kind of trade off later on.
Excellent. Thank you, Allan. If you don't mind screen sharing, I'll just wait a second for that. Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And really an honor to be here. And if you've had a chance to pick up the book, you'll see in our acknowledgements the origin story for this book, and really the origin story is with Allan. I've been in the field of subnational work on immigrant integration for a while, and Allan, as a graduate student at UCR, was pivotal in the research that went into the prior book that I did on this topic with Pradeep and Gosekaram, called The New Immigration Federalism. A lot of that book focused on the rise of restrictionist activity on immigration after 2001, with Arizona playing a central role, but not just Arizona, right? We talked about a national network that was operating at multiple levels to proliferate immigration restriction. We did talk about a wave of pro-immigrant integration and legislation, at the state and local levels, really picking up speed after 2008 and really accelerating after 2012. But that was a smaller part of the book. That was essentially one chapter that looked at the pro-immigrant integration side. And Allan thought that, here was an opportunity to actually dig deeper into that and to explore more in terms of what was happening in California. So if you look at the cover of our book, you'll see that Arizona and California play starring roles, not just in the cover, but even in some of the motivation. And it's really the genesis of this book is with Allan saying, hey, let's look deeper here. Allan has a lot of deep expertise in political philosophy or political theory, depending on how, which discipline you're in, and talking about that. So really, this book is I would say it's the most ambitious thing I've been involved in date, and it's really thanks to that collaboration with Allan and his strengths coming into this, drawing on political theory and really pushing the envelope in terms of how we think about citizenship as something that's not exclusive to the national level. So that's a bit of backstory, and if you read the acknowledgements, you'll get a bit more of that flavor of what it was like in terms of Allan taking leadership and pushing this idea forward, and us collaborating along the way. Next slide. So part of this, part of the title, or the subtitle of the book, is state rights. And when most people think about state rights, they think about the term states' rights, which does not have a pleasant history in the United States. Either if you go back to the days of slavery and what states' rights meant during the constitutional moment, or more recently during the era of Jim Crow, when state rights or states' rights was just a cover for states and localities to oppress their populations. So what we do in this book is to acknowledge that when we talk about state rights, it's not just, an optimistic picture. There's a lot of pain and suffering and violence that it has entailed. Next slide. At the same time, there are other examples of federalism and state rights in the sense of states advancing rights, where there's a progressive federalism story, right? So it's not about federalism as an excuse for state governments to oppress their populations, but state governments serving as those laboratories of innovation. And if you look at women's suffrage, right, we just got past the centennial of the women's right to vote at the national level. But if you look at the story of women's suffrage, it's something that started in localities in the West, spread to states in the West, and then to the rest of the country. So that's an important history to also unearth when we were talking about citizenship rights. We'll talk about what we mean by citizenship rights in a little bit, but that there is a positive story to be told about federalism as well. Next slide. And more recently, this is the story of marriage rights as well, right? The story, it's a pretty quick one after centuries of exclusion. But what we saw is a combination of state courts, state legislatures, and then ultimately the US Supreme Court validating right at the national level that really took off in localities, went to states, and then finally got affirmed at the national level. Next slide. So that's, most generally our where we touch back is to reanimate this idea of federalism, of states as laboratories of innovation, and really going back to this quotation by Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, that a state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. So we look at this in the context not only of immigrant rights, but of citizenship rights more generally. Next slide. Now, there's so many different figures in the book. If there are two figures that summarize what we do, it would be these two, and we will get back to them in a minute. But what we do in our book is to reimagine citizenship, both at the national level, but also to put it in a federal framework, and then to see citizenship in that federalism framework as relational. So we talk about progressive state citizenship, regressive state citizenship, and reinforcing state citizenship. So there's a lot here to unpack. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about for the next little while. And then Allan is going to take his expertise in American political development and walk you through how this plays out in the context of Black civil rights and immigrant rights in the United States. Next slide. So first, before we talk about state citizenship, what is citizenship? And what we do in our book is to go back to the basics and try to excavate how other scholars have talked about citizenship, and really to systematize the concept of citizenship the way that comparative scholars have done in the field of democracy. So when we think about citizenship, you can look at the work of those like Charles Tilly and Rogers Brubaker and Peter Schuck and others. And the formulation is a very simple one. By the way, this is the formulation that most lawyers and legal scholars adopt, that citizenship is centrally tied to legal status, and it is a necessary and sufficient determinant. It controls access to various political, social, and civil rights. So in its simplest formulation, legal status means access to rights. No legal status means no access to rights. And so that's one fundamental approach that is still very much the dominant view of citizenship. Now, there's all sorts of literature and transnationalism that challenges that. But in a very fundamental way, Rogers Brubaker, for example, has shown powerfully that states, in this case, national governments, can control access to various rights and benefits, so that if you don't have a passport, if you don't have legal status, they can exclude you. They can also remove you from the country. So no matter what states like California, New Jersey, Illinois, New York, and others try to do to try to protect what we would call their citizens, the national government has plenary power. It has full authority to remove those individuals. And so that's the ultimate test. Citizenship is something where legal status reigns supreme. Next slide. Now, in response to that, you've seen scholarship, both in the United States and elsewhere, that tries to get away from legal status as the be-all and end-all of citizenship. So contrary to that dominant narrative, we've seen plenty of work that conceives of citizenship as multidimensional. And this builds on the tradition of T.H. Marshall, seeing citizenship as having multiple dimensions, acknowledging that progress on some dimensions might not automatically mean progress on others, and to advance notions of partial citizenship. So Elizabeth Cohen's work is very strong in this regard, about talking about citizenship that is partial and not complete, and being fairly stable in its partiality, if you will. There's other scholarship in American legal studies as well as comparative politics that has fleshed out this notion of multiple meanings of citizenship, multiple dimensions of citizenship. Now, while this is important, this literature has had some limitations. Next slide. So it's helpful in terms of moving away from this litmus test of what citizenship means, confining citizenship to legal status. And it has a broader conception of including political, social, and civil rights, but also adding things that go beyond rights, like participation in society and having a sense of belonging. We find this to be limiting, and part of where we think why this literature has not caught on in the legal field and among practitioners is that this conception of citizenship combines legal status, which is the right to have rights, political, social, and civil rights, which are rights themselves, participation in society, which is the exercise of those rights, and a sense of belonging, which goes beyond rights and is an attitudinal measure. We think that it's possible to keep a sense of multidimensional citizenship that is grounded in rights, to talk about jurisdictions as the providers of those rights, and to systematize this notion of citizenship, borrowing from the rich tradition in comparative politics on the democracy literature, on concept systematization. We look to do that in terms of citizenship in general, and for subfederal citizenship in particular. Next slide. So our definition of citizenship is very simple. In some ways it's deceptively simple. We'll show you some conceptual maps that really elaborate on this. We define citizenship as a provision of rights by a political jurisdiction to its members. And it has different components. So Allan, if you could animate what we have there. So one, we are talking about political membership as opposed to other types of membership. So citizenship, broadly speaking, is about membership, but it's a political membership. It is a membership that is rooted in political jurisdictions as opposed to other types of political entities like political parties and interest groups. And three, it involves a meaningful provision of rights as opposed to other types of political dynamics involving states, in this case, governments and social actors. Next slide. Now, if you look at the concept systematization literature by David Collier and various other colleagues, we see that when you think about citizenship as a concept hierarchy, it almost doesn't matter where you start, right? In terms of where you establish something as the root concept and where you would identify either overarching concepts or classic subtypes. So we could think of citizenship itself as a root concept, right? And so then you can think of membership at the highest level there as an overarching concept that is several layers removed. Alternatively, we can think of political membership as the root concept, and then think of membership as an overarching concept, one layer removed, and then you can drill down to various subtypes of that to get to citizenship, and then below that to national citizenship and state citizenship. It really doesn't matter where you start in terms of what you call the root concept, but this is a helpful diagram to see what the various possibilities are. Next slide. So let's start first with membership as the overarching concept. You could call that the root concept if you want, but we will consider the root concept here as political membership. The overarching concept is membership. And this just illustrates that there are different kinds of membership beyond political membership that are meaningful in many ways. So for example, racial and ethnic membership, someone who's a Korean American, or in my case, someone who's South Asian American. There is a kind of important membership there that is not political. It's a racial and ethnic membership. You can also think of membership as being a religious membership, or a national or diasporic membership, being a part of the overseas Chinese population or the overseas Indian population. With Super Bowl coming up, we can also think of membership as involving a sports or entertainment fan base. We might joke that Steeler Nation, but it's real. I know I walk around my neighborhood in Southern California, there are people with Steelers flags that go up. Maybe not as much Tampa Bay Buccaneers flags, but there are important markers of membership that start looking like national membership or citizenship, but they're different. These are not political memberships. Within political membership, of course, there are different kinds of concepts that are examples of that. You can talk about US citizenship. You can talk about someone being a Republican or a member of the NRA. These are all political memberships, and we'll dig deeper into what that means. Next slide. So drilling one level deeper, we define citizenship as a jurisdiction-based political membership, as opposed to, say, party membership or interest group-based political membership. Going one level below that, we argue that citizenship, at least our definition, is one that is grounded in rights. So if people want to talk about citizenship as something related to participation, we can talk about someone's identity as a voter or a campaign contributor. We can talk about citizenship, not citizenship. We can talk about jurisdiction-based political membership as based on representation. So you would call that person a constituent. You can have jurisdiction-based political membership that is based on power. So you can talk about decision makers and agenda setters. And then finally, you can talk about jurisdiction-based political membership that is based in identity. You can talk about Americans. You can talk about Californians. We argue that what distinguishes citizenship is the grounding in rights. Next slide. Now, some people may argue that state citizenship is a partial form of citizenship. But here again, when we look at the literature from democracy in comparative politics, they argue that there is a difference between a kind hierarchy and a part-whole hierarchy. So we argue that partial citizenship is part of this part-whole hierarchy. Later on, we'll talk about different dimensions of rights. So you can talk about partial citizenship at the national level and at the state level and at the local level. That is dependent on how many dimensions of rights are guaranteed or activated. But that does not make state citizenship a partial citizenship. A state citizenship is a subtype of citizenship in a federalism context, and it's possible to talk about full citizenship at the state level as well as the local level. Next slide. Now, before we get to the federalism part, what we do, if you recall that multiple dimensions, it was not exclusive to rights. It had legal status, which is the right to have rights. It had political, social, and economic rights. It had the exercise of rights, and it had a sense of belonging, which was an attitude. We argue that it's possible to talk about citizenship firmly grounded in rights and having multiple dimensions. The first dimension, and this really builds on Allan's dissertation, is the right to free movement. Allan's dissertation, which is also going to be a book forthcoming, it looks at runaway slaves and the kind of federalism conflicts that it generated in the antebellum period compared to the movement of undocumented persons in the United States today. But that first dimension is something we just take for granted, is the right to move freely about the country, like that Southwest jingle says. But we know that some people have greater freedom to move about than others, and it's important to excavate that. Second dimension is the right to due process and legal protection. There are several rights that are resident in that, and we argue that this is something that we can look at both at the national level and at the state level. Third dimension is what we call the right to develop human capital. This is a container for a whole bunch of rights. So for example, the US Supreme Court has determined that there is a fundamental right to get a K-12 education, right? It's a Plyler v. Doe decision. People talk about a right to housing. People talk about a right to healthcare. People talk about a right to clean water. What do all of these mean? We think that it's helpful to think about these as part of a more general set of rights, which is the right to develop human capital. And by the way, this is where we talk about the right to marry as involving both the right to develop human capital as well as the right to identify and belong. And we'll get to that in a minute. Now, some have argued maybe we should talk about this as a right to develop, a right to human development. And that's something we can talk about in the question and answer session. We think it's powerful and important to talk about these as human capital rights. The fourth dimension is the right to participate and be represented. And this involves not only voting, but even being able to count for representation. We know the Trump administration was trying to remove the ability of non-citizens and potentially undocumented US persons from being represented through the process of congressional apportionment. The Biden administration has ended that intent, but that's something that is important and sometimes taken for granted or assumed that certain persons don't have a right to be represented, but in fact they do. And then finally, we have the right to identify and belong. So we can think about this in terms of, right now, the Biden administration, as part of its plan on immigration, is proposing to remove all references of the word alien in the US Code. This is something that California did a few years ago. It's a powerful symbol to be able to do that. And it's part of that right to identify and belong. But even beyond the immigration context, when you think about transgender individuals, and you look at states like California and others that are moving beyond the binary gender category and what a driver's license can say, that is a powerful example of states controlling, expanding, or potentially contracting the right of persons to identify and belong. Next slide. So first, so this book is hitting so many notes, and people may love or take issue with any one of these things that we do. One is to lay out these 5 dimensions of rights. And then we say it's not exclusive to the federal level. It is possible at the state level and at the local level as well. Often there's conflict when you have this federalism framework in terms of these different rights at these various levels. But there's also a lot of accommodation and evolution over time. And this evolution is structured by broader dynamics in federalism involving the US Constitution, courts at the federal and state level, Congress, parties, and social movements. Next slide. And there are variants of state citizenship. So not only can you think about this as like a multi-layered cake, if you will, but given that conflict produces different types of state citizenship, and we conceive of these 3 different types of state citizenship as relational in nature. So we take the federal government as providing the baseline, and then we can talk about progressive state citizenship as instances where states expand rights over and above those established at the national level, and or establishing state level protected classes in the absence of federal rights. So imagine that there is no federal government is silent on a particular population and their access to rights. We consider as progressive if states create a protected class that is not defined at the national level. And we have different examples here. Black voting rights in the antebellum North, non-citizen voting primarily among whites in the pre-World War I period, women's suffrage in states pre-1919, gay marriage in states pre-2015, and the immigrant rights regime in California after 2015. On the other side, it is also possible to talk about regressive state citizenship. This includes immigrant rights regimes in states like Arizona and Georgia. But if you look further back, bans on Black voting in the antebellum North, slavery and re-enslavement laws in the antebellum South, Jim Crow laws, voter ID laws after 2006, etc. These are cases where states restrict or erode rights that are provided at the national level, and or they establish state level pariah classes, is the opposite of a protected class, where the federal government is silent on a particular population. Finally, we can think of reinforcing citizenship, where state governments take federal boundaries of who has rights and who don't have rights and apply them to state level rights. And this can either move in an inclusionary direction or an exclusionary direction. So when states take federal laws on anti-discrimination and make them the basis of state anti-discrimination laws, adding further penalties, for example, that would be a reinforcing type of state citizenship that moves in an inclusionary direction. On the other hand, if you look at state driver's license laws in most states in the country, including Arizona and elsewhere, using federal legal status as a way to deny people access to state driver's licenses would be an example of exclusionary state citizenship. It is not regressive, and we can talk about that more in the Q&A. We call that reinforcing because it's the state using a federal template to then control access to state level rights. Naturalization requirements for state employment would be another example of exclusionary state citizenship. Straight restrictions on welfare eligibility based on federal citizenship status would be another example of reinforcing citizenship that is exclusionary. So I'm going to stop there, turn it over to Allan, who's going to dig deeper into state citizenship in the American political development context.
Now, to just give a forewarning, I'm going to try to keep this to about 10 minutes. So I'm going to highlight and kind of place our framework for understanding and seeing state citizenship into a historical understanding of Black citizenship rights, and then also immigrant citizenship rights. And what we argue in chapter 3 of our book, after setting up this conceptual framework, is that there are a few kind of key explanatory factors that work together to kind of explain developments in national citizenship and also state citizenship. And Karthick has already alluded to some of these things, but I wanted to kind of break this down before going into each of the historical periods. And so we look at the US Constitution and amendment activities, so things like the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, as providing a critical framework for national and state citizenship to develop. We also look at court interpretation as kind of interpreting and narrowing or expanding that framework for state citizenships to emerge that are either progressive, regressive, or reinforcing. And then the kind of more of the action from our explanatory framework looks at social movement strength and political party activity. And then also what is happening through executive actions to enforce the laws that are in place federally and at the state level. So these factors together, we argue, explains the development of state citizenship throughout American history and for different groups. And what the book does is unpacks this explanatory framework and applies the conceptual framework to understand Black citizenship rights in 3 distinctive periods throughout American history. We look at the slavery period, the Framers' Constitution period, also the Jim Crow era, and the Civil Rights era today. And what we argue is that the constitutional framework continues to allow this type of federated dynamic around state citizenship to emerge. And to give an example from the antebellum era, federal law essentially denied free Blacks from having any national rights to citizenship. It also created a kind of a very harsh enforcement regime around slavery law under the fugitive slave laws. And this created tension between the federal government and northern states that sought to provide Black rights. And so in the North, we saw states like Massachusetts in particular, and Pennsylvania and New York providing a range of rights to free Blacks and to runaway slaves that contrasted and challenged what was happening at the national level. And we argue that these dynamics around the constitutional framework, around what was happening in the legislature and movement building, explain these factors that happen and explain the type of progressive state citizenship that happened or emerged in Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and a few other states. And reinforcing during this period, since Blacks lacked any meaningful rights at the national level, essentially meant that states in the South were just reinforcing what had already been set by the national government in terms of slavery and denying Black rights. And importantly, when we contrast this in antebellum era to the Jim Crow era, we start to see that the Constitution and the amendment activity that occurred redefined what state citizenship would look like and how it emerged. So rather than restrictive exclusionary laws reinforcing federal law, they actually moved state citizenship in a regressive direction, where states were able to erode the rights that were provided under the 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment and civil rights laws through the Reconstruction era. They were able to erode those rights at the state level. And a lot of factors were at play, but one important element was just the fact that the federal government was unwilling to step in and stay in the South to enforce federal law, to enforce federal rights. So we have this tension between state and federal governments throughout the Jim Crow era that allow for these really robust regressive state citizenship regimes to grow and develop what we often think of as just Jim Crow laws. And so at the same time, nationally, we see that the factors that would lead to a type of progressive movement were absent most of the time. So the type of movement building required to push for progressive state policies often weren't strong enough. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party essentially excluded Blacks and stopped fighting for Black rights throughout the 20th century, up until the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, when we saw a more robust national civil rights movement grow. So it was only when civil rights took this national platform that we saw political parties start to take Black rights more seriously. So essentially, denied rights at the national level, or the enforcement of federal law, allowed regressive state citizenships to emerge throughout the 20th century, denying Black rights. And we apply the same periodization, which looks very similar for immigrant rights history, and this kind of highlights the importance of the Constitution, the amendment activity. But immigrant rights and immigration has its own history in terms of constitutional law. It also has its own history in terms of plenary power. So one of the important things about this framework and the comparisons, or applying this framework to immigrants, is to really understand the type of work that could be done at the state level in terms of expanding and contracting rights. So we often think of immigration as exclusive to the national level. So not just citizenship exclusive to legal status, but immigration control as being exclusive to the federal government after the 1880s. But states continue to pass a range of laws, kind of highlighted by California's anti-Chinese laws early on. But then even after the 1900s, we continue to see California and Arizona and other states deny a range of rights along our framework to different immigrant groups, to Chinese, Japanese, to the undocumented eventually. So states and localities continue to play an essential role in either expanding or contracting those rights. Looking specifically at California, we track kind of these policies and how California's history, for much of its history, it's led in a regressive and restrictive exclusionary state citizenship. So it built upon federal laws that were exclusionary and harsh. It also went beyond what the federal laws were doing to deny rights to immigrants throughout its history. We kind of see in the 1990s with Proposition 187, where K through 12 children were effectively denied access to school despite the constitutional court decision by the Supreme Court in Plyler v. Doe. And we saw that through Prop 187 that California leaders were also trying to become active enforcers, requiring school teachers and other officials to enforce federal immigration law to report the status of undocumented children and families. And so in the 1990s, 187 essentially marks the endpoint of California's history because of the many changes happening within the state politically, in terms of the rise of Latino officials, the birth of a larger, more robust immigrant rights movement. And we argue through our framework that California kind of turned the corner in the late 1990s, but it took 2 decades of movement building and working actively to connect immigrant rights organizations with state leaders to pass a range of policies that effectively created what we call progressive state citizenship. So these policies, we argue, by 2015, had kind of tipped the scales to being able to argue that California has, across all 5 dimensions, provided these rights, these kind of core rights to citizenship to undocumented immigrants. And other states are moving in this direction. We see movement happening in New York and Illinois and in other states today in the country. And so conceptualizing kind of this development over time allows us to see kind of the factors at play, how states are really important jurisdictions to think about citizenship, that they're essential for providing and protecting rights. And there are a lot of things at play in terms of movement building and strategizing to make this happen. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Karthick briefly, and then we'll move on to the discussions.
Thank you, Allan. In terms of future directions in state citizenship, one of the things it's been a labor of love, and if you look at when this news story was published in the LA Times, it was over 5 years ago. And really the work that Allan and I were doing well before the book, we wrote a policy brief at UC Riverside, for the School of Public Policy, and really started talking about state citizenship as something that California was developing. And there are different ways of measuring impact. And we're really proud through the public engagement work we were doing way back when to inform, not only to do this through op-ed writing, which Allan and I did at the LA Times and elsewhere, but to have a front page story in the LA Times that takes our concept and validates it in such an amazing way was just really gratifying. Now, it's one thing to have something in the front page of the LA Times that takes a concept like California citizenship and socialize people into that idea, to actually have that idea be socialized in a deeper way. And we see this book as an early attempt among a few others that are pushing in this direction for us to not only recognize that states play an important role in immigrant integration, but to really think about states as important venues for citizenship rights more broadly, not only for immigrant persons, but also for US born persons, including Black and African American individuals and others. So really thrilled to have had some early success, and we hope that this will continue as this book enters the academic bloodstream, if you will, and hopefully the work of social movement actors and others. Next slide. More recently, and again, the work that Allan and I do is not just ivory tower academia. We want to fully acknowledge the partnership that we have with organizations that are doing the work in states like New York. So after Allan and I put out our first policy memo, we helped organize a session with philanthropy and advocates from different parts of the country, including the New York Immigrant Coalition, which reached out to us to help build their blueprint for Immigrant New York. That was a few years ago. And one of the major planks in that blueprint was driver's licenses for all residents of New York. And that finally got passed last year. And so we're happy to have played a role there, but also with the kind of connections we've made in the state legislature in California. So Ricardo De Lara, who is a state senator who did a lot to push for the expansion, to really innovate in the expansion of citizenship rights in California, tried to get this bill passed, but he got termed out and he became the state insurance commissioner. So then Senator Durazo continued, and you can find this in California's laws that were passed. This was signed by Governor Newsom in October 2019. And it says quite simply, citizens of the state. And it defines what a citizen of the state of California is, right? Citizens of the state are all persons born in the state and residing in it, except the children of alien public ministers and consuls, and all persons born out of the state who are citizens of the United States and residing within the state. And it goes on. This bill would instead provide that a person is eligible to, so it basically talks about the ability to, for non-US citizens, but citizens of the state of California, to serve on boards and commissions, except in those cases where, it would be deemed as a kind of compensation that would be considered employment that is controlled by the federal government. So this is happening right now. This is as of just a little over a year ago in the state of California. Next slide. Looking ahead, there are a lot of possibilities when it comes to the right to develop human capital. So you have many attempts now, especially if Javier Becerra gets confirmed as a Health and Human Services Secretary. We will see states trying to use ACA waivers to expand citizenship rights in terms of the right to health care. There have been proposals over the years in terms of giving states more ability to provide work authorization, maybe a kind of point system, the way they do in Canada, where provinces are able to add points to the overall national preference system. We can also think about expansion of citizenship rights in terms of the right to participate and be represented, or to contract those rights. One of the major fights that we see in 2021 is that you had the expansion of voting rights in many states because of the pandemic. And now many states, including Arizona, that has had various restrictions, but a fairly liberal regime of absentee voting, talking about restricting those rights based on the results of the 2020 elections, not only for president, but also for US Senate. We may have avoided a certain kind of conflict when it comes to counting non-US citizens for congressional apportionment, but based on recent Supreme Court cases and conservatives in various parts of the country, we will probably see attempts to draw maps that exclude non-US citizens from state legislative boundaries. And that's something that we anticipate will be important fights on citizenship rights in 2021 and beyond. So I think that's it, Allan, and I think we're open to Q&A now.
Here we go. Hi. Okay. Thank you for the presentation. I took a lot of notes. I have questions myself, but here, let's go to Q&A. So can you both also see the Q&A from your screens? Okay. So let's see. We have a message from Chris Haynes and Sophia Wallace, both giving you their best, but saying they had to log off. So I will give the audience a couple minutes to gather their questions. Please, audience members, insert your questions into the Q&A. We will take them as they pop up. And while we wait, I can ask you the kind of reflection that I had. So I really like how you break up here the idea, the concept of citizenship into these 5 different components. And I was particularly interested in human capital, particularly right now as we are currently living in a pandemic. And so I wondered if you could just reflect briefly on how you think pretty much the intersection of your book with COVID, right? Because we haven't had a national response. We've had a very federated states' rights kind of states lead, states have to lead, states are forced to lead kind of response. And so do you see rights, I'm thinking particularly of immigrants and maybe Latino immigrants in particular, will your framework help us understand where rights will be continued to expand versus restricted? And I'm thinking about the right to health, but not just health in general, but vaccinations in particular, right? The right to work broadly, but more specifically to safely work, right? To have PPE in the workplace. So
absolutely. Yeah. And maybe I'll take a first crack at it, Allan, and toss it over to you. In addition to those examples you talked about, Angie, if you look back at essentially, even though it wasn't called cash assistance, but it was cash assistance from the federal level in terms of the stimulus checks or COVID checks that were sent out. Non-US citizens, well, especially unauthorized people without work authorization, were excluded from that relief, even though they were bearing a lot of the brunt of unemployment and other economic struggle. So you had a few states like California and others that created cash assistance programs for unauthorized residents. So that's one example where, when you look at the right to develop human capital in the context of the pandemic. California also signed expanded its Cal EITC law. This is the Earned Income Tax Credit which exists at the federal level. California passed it a few years ago at the state level, but it did not allow people that were filing taxes only based on their ITIN, which is the individual tax ID number, as opposed to their social security number from qualifying for state EITC. And they finally expanded that last year. My understanding is that when it comes to vaccination, there's so many layers, right? There's public charge at the federal level that prevented a lot of immigrants from seeking care. And so some of the state protections that were in place still meant that many immigrants in these progressive state regime states were still reluctant to access care. And even after the federal government relaxed those public charge rules when it came to COVID testing and COVID treatment, I think we're still living with the legacy effects of that harmful policy at the national level. My understanding is that all persons have the chance to get the vaccine now, and it's not based on any US legal status, but I'm not certain on that. So, to be determined, but you're absolutely right. There's all of these ways. And then beyond that, when you look at the workplace, and this is where I think we might get a little bit slippery here. We're talking about the meaningful provision of these rights. So it's one thing for a state to say all farm workers are eligible for the vaccine, but if they're not sending mobile clinics out to farm workers to make them accessible, how meaningfully are those rights being provided? Some people may dispute that these are rights. They might say that these are benefits, but I think especially when it comes to matters of life and death, it's pretty stark. It's really hard to talk about these not as rights if you're talking about the fundamental ability of individuals to survive, let alone thrive.
So I'll share just two thoughts on kind of the relationship with our book and then COVID. And so thinking about the kind of framework we use to explain how kind of progress is achieved and how this works, and throughout the reports and kind of the early ideas behind our work, we stress incremental change. So it's not passing like a full citizenship bill that addresses every single right. We really emphasize the political kind of movement process itself to achieve change. So I think of COVID as a type of crisis that could be compared to the conflicts in federalism that then spark kind of movement activity and kind of new alliances between movements and legislators. And so it's something that could spark change, and at least within California, from a movement perspective, you can see this as being able to see and bring into better focus some of the disparities across the regions or across different immigrant groups who are impacted by COVID. And so it brings those things into focus for the movement and allows them to then think about building capacity to address those and thinking about policy innovations. And so we think of it very much in line with kind of just responding to COVID as a way of leveraging and fine-tuning the immigrant rights movement and building it up around it to pass more policies. But yeah, so I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you both. Okay, so we have a question in the Q&A, and I'll just go ahead and read it out loud. This comes from Deborah Joe Borden. Thank you so much. How much influence do you feel that a state can have in improving human rights as a state citizen? You gave examples from New York and California's situation. How possible do you think it could be to expand immigrant rights in Arizona? And do you have any ideas on which angles one could take to advocate for that?
Do you want to start on this, Allan, and then I'll teaching in Arizona, I'm sure you've observed quite a bit, and with the social movements there.
Yeah, I think, this is a really important question, and also kind of has been used as a critique of the book too, in terms of rights mean something very different in California than they do in other states, and you could have states where immigrants have no rights and who are targeted, and then states where they are more protected and have rights. And this creates kind of inequalities if you think about comparing across the states. So for Arizona, I would say it kind of goes to Karthick's first book, the Immigration Federalism, where I see Arizona as kind of at least benefiting from the kind of constitutional legal challenges at the national and state level that broadly the immigrant rights movement is doing, not just in California, but elsewhere. So they're on the defense, but there is potential for building that progressive movement at the state level for policy. I also see, just from kind of some of the events that we've had on our campus where we invited Puente to talk about their work in Arizona, they're pushing for human rights by kind of reporting, and also on the defense, they're reporting to international communities and organizations. So they're reporting human rights violations to put some pressure top down on what's happening in Arizona, as well as kind of the national legal challenges. So I'll open it up to Karthick if you need.
We also have. I
No,
just
just quick. I know
share.
we're running out of time, so yeah, just go ahead, Angie.
So I'm going to read the two questions that are one from Jose Lopez and one from Paul Lewis, and then I'll let you kind of conclude with here if you want to address either or. So Jose Lopez says, by 2050, statistics from the Census Bureau says Latinos will account for 1/3 of the population. Do you think this will help towards a more progressive citizenship? And then Paul Lewis writes, it seems like state progressive citizenship is still fundamentally limited by what goes on outside a state's boundaries. For instance, same-sex marriages in one state, Obergefell and versus Hodges, that were unrecognized elsewhere in the United States, or a right to travel via state driver's licenses for undocumented people in one state that stopped at a state's borders. These recent situations seem reminiscent of the Jim Crow era stories of a mixed race person traveling on a train being considered white in one state, but then their legal race changing to black when the train crossed the state border. Realistically, how robust can state citizenship be as long as states are still part of a national union where some of the rights are limited?
Great. So let me take those, and then Allan, I'll toss over to you. Thank you. First of all, Paul, former colleague at Public Policy Institute of California and former co-author as well. I think one way, maybe quite simply, we can say that, again, I mean, this will be yet another ad campaign from a corporation. Membership has its privileges, but it also has, maybe it has its limitations too, right? So it's great to be, well, it's never great, but maybe there are certain advantages one has for being a citizen of the state of California. But once you leave California and say move cross the border into Arizona, it may be a kind of rude awakening and limitation of that kind of protective reach. That is absolutely true. And but this would be true, for example, in terms of women's suffrage. If you move from one state where women had the right to vote over to another state where they didn't, or as you say, during the Jim Crow era, Paul. We think that it is important to keep allowing states to keep pushing higher. In the past, some people have said, well, maybe if you allow states like California to do this, then it provokes a backlash in other states like Arizona. We find very little evidence for that. The kind of dynamics driving what happens in Arizona relate to the kind of federalism conflicts that get generated with the US government, as well as state activism within state parties. What Deep and I wrote a few years ago, in many ways, it was a precursor to what we see now within the Republican Party, what might have been considered the Tea Party element within the party, or the white nationalist element within the party, now has an infusion of the QAnon element within the Republican Party. So we think so yes, there are limitations, but we think one of the only ways forward, there are two ways forward. One is to build momentum, a kind of positive domino effect of rights expansion across states, like in the case of marriage rights, or to have some kind of preemptive legislation at the national level. But it's very difficult to get the Senate to pass something, even on a 50-vote rule, without having rights expansion at the state level. You are asking US senators to vote on something if they are not already familiar with what that looks like at the state level. It's just really difficult to do. So we think it's yes, there are limitations to rights expansion at the state level if it only remained within those borders. But through a kind of domino effect and through federal legislation, it's possible to then expand those rights. And we've seen historical examples. Finally, demography is not destiny. And we know that, nationally, but even in states like California and Arizona, as long as some political parties or interests are able to limit the voting power of Latinos, for example, or immigrants and those in the second generation, you will see that political struggle matters. And that's where in our framework, the role of courts, the role of parties and social movements, and not just social movements that are trying to expand rights, social movements that are trying to roll back rights. And that's very, very alive and well in many states across the United States now. I mean, you're going to see a major attempt to retrench and roll back voting rights based on what happened in 2020. So the struggle is important, and it's important for philanthropy to not only focus on federal voting rights expansion and immigrant rights expansion, but also state-based voting rights expansion and immigrant rights expansion. Allan, I'll let you close it out.
So I think that this question by Paul Lewis is really important because it highlights why the relational kind of aspect of our conceptual framework is so important, and that the state citizenship is always developed in relation to what is happening federally. And I think the political story there is kind of the onus of constitutional law, court cases, in providing and kind of securing at least some strong baseline for that would prevent regressive or even restrictive moves at the state level, but still allow for progressive kind of expansions. And so ideally that would happen where you have a baseline that prevents those two or exclusionary forms of citizenship from emerging, but still allowing for progress. And so this kind of is how we situate the book at the beginning in this first chapter, is this idea of progressive federalism and thinking about kind of contributing to that idea and thinking about states always in relation to national developments and not just what is happening individually in each state by itself. So I'll end there on that question and turn it over to Angie.
Okay, Allan, Karthik, thank you so much for sharing your book. I encourage everyone to please go out and check out their book. I know I will go and purchase the book myself. I'm teaching an immigration politics course next year, and I think it'll be a really good fit. So thank you, everyone. I hope that you can reach out to both of our speakers if you have more questions. I also wanted to put in a plug for our next speaker event, which will happen on February 19th. We will have David Cortez from the University of Notre Dame, who will be sharing his book project with us. So yeah, with that, I hope everyone is safe. I hope, again, just recognizing that we are living in a really difficult time. And yeah, I hope you and your loved ones stay safe. Rodney, did you want to say a couple words?
I just wanted to say thank you to Karthik and Allan, and thank you for all the people out there who were participating in this, listening to it, and so on. I know some of you had questions that we were not able to get to, and we apologize, but I think Allan and Karthik would welcome comments or questions about their book if you were not able to pose them today. But again, thank you for being here, and we do hope that you will continue to have interest and participate in our activities at the Center for Latinos and American Politics Research at ASU. So take care, everyone, and let me just echo Angie and say, stay well, and we will look forward to seeing you.